I just want to say to you, God will ever only take away if he knows that that which he is taking away, he will use to so fill up your cup that he will pour out a huge blessing on you. Otherwise, he wouldn't take it away. Because he is the God of Isaiah 55, who said that his word is like the snow and the rain falls from the sky, and it waters the ground, and it bears fruit. And in the same way, God's word will never, never return to him void and empty and fruitless. When God sends his word, even through you, even in a small place, and it looks like nothing really is happening, God is going to produce results. It may not be right away, and it may not be in a year, but you can be absolutely sure he's going to create results because you were there. Even if you were there for just a short time, you were there because God promised that that which he is taking away will not return to him empty. It will bear fruit someday. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about an incident in my life. I've told this at a few conferences, but I think at a few enough that probably most, if not all of you, have not heard this yet. So I'm going to dare to just say it here. An incident in my life that happened, I think, about 7 years ago or so. In fact, Wolfgang Bremiker, you may have been there, and it was at a conference for church leadership teams in Austria, and they came together, and I was to be the speaker for several days on models of church growth. And while I was there with my wife Susan during those days, I would chat with some of these pastors from Austria. You know, you have to remember, when I was 9 years old, my family moved to Austria from Germany, and we lived there south of Vienna for 6 years. My dad was a missionary under Greater Europe Mission, and my dad tried everything. He tried everything to get a church started. And those 6 years for my father felt like absolute miserable failure. So as I'm at this conference, I was talking to a few of the pastors, and I remember one conversation I had with a pastor. I said, "So where's your church?" And he told me. And I said, so how many people are in your church? He said, "Only 25. I said, "Well, only 25 is relative. How long has the church been going?" He said, 10 years. I said, "Well, okay, 10 years, 25 people. Now, how did you get 25 people?" He said, "Well, those are all people who over the 10 years converted to Jesus." I said, "You gotta be kidding me. In 10 years, in Austria, in a little village, 25 people converted to Jesus? Do you understand what you just said? That's like a miracle in Austria. 25 people in 10 years. He said, "Yeah, 25 people in 10 years. And so the conference went on until the very end, and at the very end, they were ready to close the conference. We had already determined how things will go from here and so forth, and I just felt this impulse from the Holy Spirit, and I said, "Hold on, can I just say one last word to all of you?" And the permission was granted, and at that moment I switched over to my old Austrian accent so I could speak the language that they were all speaking and become an Austrian brother to them. And I said to them in my Austrian accent, I said, "You know, I've noticed a lot of discouragement this week. Many of you are saying that you're working very hard, but it's not bearing much fruit. One of you told me your church has been going for 10 years, and you only have 25 people who converted to Jesus. I just want to say to you, you know, things today in Austria are much better than they were back in the 1960s. Because in the 1960s, if you would have told me 10 years, 25 people, I would have said that's a mega church. Because my dad was a missionary in the 1960s. My family lived south of Vienna, and my dad tried everything in the book to lead people to Christ, to start a church. And after 6 years of tent campaigns and distributing tracts and handing out books and witnessing to people on the street and knocking on doors and everything possible. He started a children's ministry until the priest came by and told the parents of the kids, if they allow their kids to come to that children's Bible study that missionary is holding, they will be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And so all the kids stopped coming. He tried everything until the Jehovah's Witnesses came and led all the people astray out of our church. And again, the church went to pieces. My dad tried everything, and after 6 years, the only person who had come to faith in Jesus was a psychologically ill man. And that's it. And after those 6 years, my dad returned to Germany. And soon after his return, he had a heart attack. It was the first of 10 heart attacks that my father had. He died. Well, no, I didn't say he died, because at that point he had not yet died. But I'm telling you, my dad did die after about 10 heart attacks several years ago. But I said to the people in Austria, I said, my dad tried everything, and one person is converted to Jesus. And you're telling me in 10 years, 25 people are converted to Jesus. People, you should be celebrating what is going on in this country right now. So that was the end of the conference. And as Susan and I were making our way to the car to drive back to Germany, this old man came up to me who was a judge in Vienna, and he says to me, "That was your dad?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Wow, when I was a kid, my parents used to refer to him as the Bible missionary. Didn't he hold a tent campaign once?" I said, "Yeah, actually I was 14 years old and I had to play the guitar and sing in front of everybody in this tent campaign." He said, "You know what? My mother came to that tent campaign. She was converted that night that she came. And she came home and she told us kids about Jesus. And the reason why I'm a follower of Jesus today is because my mother went to that tent campaign years ago that your dad organized. Is your dad still alive?" I said, "Yes, he is." He said, "Would you please tell him thank you from my family for coming to Austria and being the Bible missionary for 6 years?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll tell him that." And as I turned around and walked away, another Austrian, you won't believe this, another Austrian walks up to me and he says, "Hold on, Stefan, was that your dad?" I said, "Yeah, that was my dad." He said, "Wow." He said, "You know, there was this teenage kid who received a tract once from your dad. And he came to my place and he just showed it to me. He said, 'Look, a man on the street just gave me this,' and I read it. And that's how I came to faith in Jesus. I read this tract that your dad handed my friend. Is your dad still alive?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Would you please tell your dad thanks for coming to Austria for those 6 years?" So you can believe that Susan and I sped home from Salzburg to Gießen at that time, and I got on the phone right away with my dad, an old man in Florida at the time, and I said, "Dad, you won't believe what just happened. Those 6 years in Austria were not," what's umsonst in English? They were not a waste. They were not for granted, not a waste. I said, "Dad, I just had at least 2 guys come up to me and say the reason why they are converted and following Jesus today is because you went to Austria and did everything possible for those 6 years. And you didn't see any fruit, but Dad, there's fruit. There's all this fruit now." And my dad just sobbed and sobbed on the phone. And then he said, "Thank you, son. Now I can go home to Jesus." Es war nicht umsonst. It was not for nothing. And I like to share that story with discouraged workers of Jesus. There is no such thing as failure unless you're faithless. Because anything you do for Jesus, it will bear fruit. You may not see it right away, and you may not see it in a few years, but it is going to bear fruit. So take heart, move forward, and do not despise the day of small beginnings. So let me close with just some practical tips for moving forward with God's movement. First of all, it's time for us, especially German and Dutch congregations, but others too, to recognize that when God is on the move, we can expect chaos in our churches. And we can expect that God is going to start doing things where we feel it's out of control. And if there's anything that God is showing me, is that I just cannot control this, what he is doing. So I am ready for surprises. I am learning to be far more spontaneous and flexible. And I am learning to accept chaos. I'm also learning, as a wise person once told us in Frankfurt, don't feel like you have to resolve every tension there is in your congregation. There will be tension. When you put that many cultures together in one place, there's going to be tension. We have to be wise in recognizing which tensions do we need to speak into before they blow up the church, and which tensions are there as sort of just a normal development of interpersonal relationships, intercultural relationships, and they'll get resolved in time. May the Lord give us wisdom to expect chaos and to expect that things are going to be out of our control. We also need to understand or accept humility as our role in this whole movement of God. We need, every one of us, regardless of whatever culture we come from, we need to be able to say, my culture is not the best culture there is. I think it's kind of funny because I'm a German amongst Germans, and yet I have enough American and Canadianism and Jewishness and whatever else in my system that at times I'm also the guy on the outside looking in. I just find it funny how Germans are always criticizing themselves for being people who don't know what humor is, people who don't know what flexibility is. Everything has to be very orderly and very organized and very thorough, and they'll criticize themselves for it because they know that sometimes it's not the best way to be. But they'll never change themselves. We just go on being the same way, even though we recognize that there are moments where that's not the best way to be. And I think what I'm trying to say is that we need, whatever culture you're from, we need to develop the humility that our culture is not the best culture. It may be the lead culture or the base culture of our church community, but it is not the best culture. And we need to learn from other cultures and open ourselves to other cultures, be flexible with other cultures, which reminds me of something I learned from Alex Hirsch a few months ago at a conference where he was speaking, and that is, he had heard from some wise man, if you have an intercultural church, the best that you will do, say for a worship service, is when somebody is 70% satisfied with the worship service. If any one person in an intercultural church is 100% satisfied with the worship service, something went wrong. Because when you have a bunch of people from a bunch of cultures worshiping God together, something is going to happen that some culture doesn't think is really the best way to say it or to sing it or to do it. And so if people come away saying, well, 70% of our worship service was good, you're doing well. And if they're saying 100% was great, you're doing awful. So it's just a whole new mentality that we have to develop, and a humility that actually, I don't think we really know how to do church anymore. Right? When it comes to being intercultural. And we're having to learn all brand new, all over again, we're having to learn how to be a church of monos and multis in one worship service. Another point that I want to impress upon us is use the resources that you've learned and heard about at this conference. One of the highlights for me was that those 20 minutes or half hour yesterday when we had a number of resources flashed up on the screen for us. And I thought, oh yes, finally we are moving from the theology to the principles to, and here's what you can use in order to get the job done. Thank you very much for making the ministry a little easier for us by just sharing the resources with us. So I want to remind you that Rini Visser has been working on at this site where she has songs that have been translated, that she has translated into different languages, and we all, as we're all part of this movement, can access that address, and through Rini's service, we can download songs that we can use in our worship service in all kinds of languages. So here's somebody who's making worship easier for us. Thank you, Rini. Easier for us as intercultural churches. I just want to encourage you, write that down and start using it, because the worship team here that sang and played yesterday morning and this morning, they got their songs from there and by interacting with Rini. So you can do the same. And then I also want to let you know that the PowerPoint presentations that we saw in the resources that Mrs. Kyle gave us and Mr. Bonham gave us yesterday, we want to make all that available to you. I know that went by us very quickly, so I checked with Florian. He is going to make sure that all of you get this by email. Again, those PowerPoint slides. So you have all those resources at your access. I'm going to encourage us, Florian, also to download it onto that website so that people, even people who were not at our conference, can begin to access those resources that were brought to us yesterday. Another resource that we can use is this book that is lying back there now, MissionMosaik Kirche. I want to encourage all of you German speakers to be sure that you do not leave this conference without taking at least one copy of that book with you. Now, I'm saying this, it's kind of hard to say this when you're the author, but the fact of the matter is I am not going to get a single cent from the 10 euros that you are paying for that book at 50% off. All the money that Susan and I get from that book goes back into MissionMosaik. So this is just one way that we can help fund this movement, and so you're actually supporting and ministering to the movement if you take the book with you. But so much is explained in this book, and Frauke Bielefeld really helped me put it together to the point where Brunnen would accept it as a book that they publish. that there's just so much in this book in terms of resources, in terms of how-tos, in terms of experiences from which we've learned how to do a worship service for an intercultural congregation, what kind of outreach opportunities are there, how to go about them, how quickly to baptize somebody, and how to develop a multicultural community, and how to overcome particular fears that you have about people who are strangers, particularly about Muslims or the whole Islamist issue. It's all in that book. So I want to encourage you to take it with you. And if you think that there are others in your church that would be interested in reading the book, or if you think this is a way you can motivate people in your church to get on board with this mission that God is on, then you can take a whole pack of 10 books with you, because it comes in packs of 10. You can take a pack of 10 with you without having to pay for them, and then when you sell those books in your congregation at 50%, you just put the money into an envelope and send it to Susan when you're all done. So we can do it that way without you having to pay anything here. If you want the book in English, well, it's not out in English yet. There's a conversation going on next week between a colleague of mine and Tyndale Publishers to get it printed in English. It's already in English, but to get it published in English. So you can pray about that. But what we can give you now is a pre-publication edition in English, where you have a lot of chapter 1, which describes the development, and a lot of chapter 6, which describes what exactly is a multicultural church. What exactly do we mean by a mosaic of a church? That you would get in the pre-published English version. And if you want that, we'll send it to you. All you have to do before you go home today is put your name and email address on a list that Susan will have back at the book table, and we'll send that to you. Also, I want to let you know that several of us, especially our dear film crew that is here, we are starting a ministry called Mosaik Web Team that we pray we can really kick off in the fall. That will be a regular putting out of videos on YouTube and other places, including our MissionMosaik site, where we're just teaching principles about the multicultural church in a special time of God's mission in Europe. And finally, how or where do things go from here? We will continue to have conferences of this nature. We are in discussion in the leadership team of Europe right now as to how often to have the conference. The last decision we made was that we will have a Europe-wide conference every other year, and then like this one, and we will have more regional conferences or national conferences in the years between, which would mean that next year we would have a conference that is German-speaking for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, and another conference that is Holland or ICP Holland or Holland and Belgium or something of that sort. But there's actually, we're uncertain at this point exactly what to do. But you have an evaluation sheet, a feedback sheet, in front of you, and we would appreciate it if you hand that in before you leave in a few minutes, including what you think about having this conference every year. That's, I think, the last question. That will help us decide, and we will be sure to let you know the decision as to when and where the next conference will be held.